Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Paul Barber. Our top stories this hour. Finding a way out. More foreign nationals are evacuated from Khartoum as the European Union calls for a negotiated end to the fighting in Sudan.
We cannot afford that Sudan, which is a very populated country, implodes, because it will be sending shockwaves around the whole Africa.
Ripple effect, why the fighting in Sudan is ringing alarm bells all across the region. Russia's foreign minister says the chances of extending a deal on grain exports from Ukraine are not great, as he chairs 2 Security Council meetings at the United Nations. And astronomical spending, how the space industry has boomed more than half a century after China's first satellite launch. Well, thousands of foreigners are being airlifted out of Sudan's capital as fierce fighting between the army and paramilitary forces continues for a 10th day. More than 1,000 EU nationals have been evacuated from Khartoum, along with citizens from China, Japan and diplomats from the UK and the United States. The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, says despite the evacuations, the bloc will keep pushing for a political settlement to end the conflict, which has killed at least 420 people and triggered a humanitarian crisis.
So it has been a successful operation, but complex. It was in touch with the 2 generals fighting in Sudan. And now the ceasefire is stopped, it's over. We have to continue pushing for a political settlement. We cannot afford that Sudan, which is a very populated country, implodes, because it will be sending shockwaves around the whole Africa.
Egypt, which shares a border with Sudan, is playing a significant role in the evacuations, as well as ongoing diplomatic efforts to try to secure a ceasefire. Our correspondent Adel El-Marouhi joins us now from Cairo. Adel, what is the latest on how the evacuation efforts are progressing?
Well, there is a massive coordination happening between the capitals of the world and Cairo, trying to get a coordination between Egypt, which shares a long border with Sudan, into evacuating its citizens, its diplomatic missions to Cairo. Now, the access to Egypt is quite numerous. There are, of course, flight access, ground access through vehicles, and through the Red Sea, of course, through ships and vessels. What we've been seeing since early hours in the morning at dawn, that buses carrying dozens of Egyptians and other nationalities, as well as Sudanese, have been crossing the southern border, the land border between Egypt and Sudan. Egypt earlier this morning declared that it has so far evacuated 436 of its citizens through buses, but these are not people who were in Khartoum. The Egyptian capital has been advising its citizens in Sudan, we're talking about more than 10,000 are there, and the government intends to evacuate them, that to stay, those in Khartoum to remain until it's clear and safe for them to move. And the similar routes have been happening. Everyone who managed to escape the fighting in Khartoum managed to find a way out of it. It's more or less a bit safer for them to take any transportation mode and go there. Port Sudan is also one of the main hubs now to gather citizens and foreigners in Sudan to take ferries from there, from the Red Sea, crossing either to Saudi Arabia or going north to Cairo.
Adele, we were just listening to Josep Borrell. The concern from the EU and amongst other powers is that the situation really could escalate. What do we know about the fighting right now in Khartoum and elsewhere in Sudan?
It is not looking promising, Paul. This is the 10th day of the fighting, and it has been going on intense. Fast fighting techniques have been mobilized on the ground. There's no specific location or target to be hit, so it's very random. Hundreds have been killed, thousands have been injured. The health sector has been seeing unprecedented pressure. It's near collapsing, and every effort to push for a ceasefire has so far failed. The Arab League is investing all its diplomatic efforts to broker a ceasefire. Cairo, Egypt and the UAE too are all trying to influence their sides, because Egypt is a very strong partner and ally to the Sudanese military, while the UAE have strong ties to Hamidati, the commander of the RSF forces involved in the clashes against the Sudanese armed forces. So despite all of these efforts and international powers also getting involved to mediate, there hasn't been a successful attempt for them to sit on a negotiating table. This remains to be the prime concern, but everyone wants a ceasefire, stop the violence, and that may be enable them to help reach a negotiating table and both parties sit and discuss that out.
Adel, thanks so much for that update. Adel El Marouhi from Cairo there. Well, of course, the eyes of the world are on the battles raging in Sudan's capital, but other regions in the country are also struggling with violent clashes between rival groups. CGTN's Nick Madimba reports.
The fighting between the Sudanese military and the paramilitary rapid support forces, which has claimed hundreds of lives so far, has been largely centered in Khartoum, the capital city. But clashes have been reported in other parts of the country. Local observers in Nyala, the capital of South Darfur, report that at least 22 people died on the first day of fighting. Since then, the violence has intensified and has claimed many more civilian lives. Sudan is also contending with other regional issues and tensions. The fate of Abyei, a disputed region between Sudan and South Sudan, still hangs in the balance. The dispute has not been resolved since South Sudan's independence in 2011. Abyei has rich oil reserves, and that has made the region economically desirable to both Sudan and South Sudan. Diplomats and experts are issuing warnings that the Horn of Africa is already vulnerable due to situations like the anti-terror war in Somalia and conflicts in South Sudan and northern Ethiopia, which have resulted in deaths of tens of thousands of people and the displacement of millions more. Sudan shares borders with 7 countries, 5 of those, Libya, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia and Chad, have recently seen armed conflict or differences between partners in government. Egypt and Eritrea are Sudan's other immediate neighbors. Any full-scale conflict in Sudan could also derail the already protracted negotiations over a controversial dam Ethiopia is building on the Nile, an essential source of water and electricity for many countries. Ethiopia had more than 2 million internally displaced people, an outcome of natural disasters and a brutal conflict between the country's federal government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front that governed the Tigray region. Ethiopia also hosts nearly 1 million refugees and asylum seekers from Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia and Eritrea. Meanwhile, Chad is home to 370,000 Sudanese refugees. Nick Madimba, CGTN.
Sudan lies at the crossroads of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. But for most of its independent history, the country has faced substantial internal conflict that's weakened its ability to play a leadership role in the region. Well, Dr. Matthew Benson is a Sudan Research Director at the Conflict and Civicness Research Group within the London School of Economics. Delighted to say he joins us now. Thank you very much indeed. As I was saying, Sudan, of course, seen a lot of violence in its modern history. I know that your research has looked at how the colonial legacy of the country's economic structure has fueled this. Was this latest violence, sadly, quite predictable?
I wouldn't say it was predictable. We were certainly aware of the extreme risk that was taking place, but it's different than other previous conflicts that have taken place because it's primarily urban warfare at the moment that we're seeing. No other, with the exception of the British attack in order to reconquer Sudan at the turn of the last century, there's not been really much evidence of urban warfare taking place. People have really avoided doing that. And this is perhaps why it's so shocking, so deadly, and of deep concern.
And what does the fighting mean for Sudan's neighbours, and which do you think are most at risk due to the possible spillover of the unrest?
I mean, as your previous correspondent said, the region already hosts 4.9 million refugees. I mean, he didn't say the number, but that's the most primary concern, to really be thinking about how is it that you can really support this much people in a region that is already struggling to maintain a lot of this stuff already. So that would be my first concern, is really around humanitarian issues. The second would really be around drawing lots of other countries from the region, such as Egypt, Libya, where there's a lot of already suspected criminal activity taking place with neighboring Darfur. So we'd really be thinking about how is it that you can kind of constrain that and actually make it easier for international actors such as the UK, the US, and others to actually mediate some sort of ceasefire.
Well, let's speak a little bit more about that, if we could, beyond the continent. What external powers have the most at stake in Sudan's future, and can they really broker a peace?
I would say the whole world has a stake in maintaining the future of Sudan. It is enormously important on so many levels. First and foremost, I would say that we need to make sure that there's a solid Sudan that is stable in order to maintain peace and stability in a region which is already very volatile. So I would say that's my primary concern.
And as fighting continues despite multiple attempts at a ceasefire, how do you see this conflict resolving in the short term?
The ideal way that this scenario would play out is that for the first time, the international community actually work with civic actors on the ground and no longer sideline them. These are the people who've already been delivering humanitarian assistance to themselves, some of the world's most vulnerable people, but also to internationals in this instance. So I would say that we need to learn how to work with a wide-ranging, somewhat acephalous civil society movement through resistance committees and things, and actually look at some sort of humanitarian corridor. So there's already been sophisticated efforts in order to get internationals out, particularly the U.S. effort. So we see that something like that is possible. That Sudan and South Sudan were actually home to one of the world's most elaborate peace operations in order to get humanitarian assistance to people, known as Operation Lifeline Sudan from the early 90s and late 80s. And so I would look at those experiences and really think about how can we deliver humanitarian assistance through these corridors in order to negotiate a ceasefire, but for the first time actually put civic groups at the forefront of this and not the military actors who fought their way to the table.
Matthew Benson, we really appreciate your thoughts on this today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
In other news, the former UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon is in Myanmar for talks with the country's military leader. State television showed him in the capital Naypyidaw on Sunday, along with a small delegation. It was reported that he later met with deputy ministers for defence and foreign affairs. Ban is representing a group called the Elders, which engages in peacemaking and human rights initiatives. There's major disruption at Germany's Berlin and Hamburg airports as staff stage a 24-hour walkout. Hundreds of flights have been cancelled in both cities after workers in security, passenger control and customs went on strike as part of an ongoing dispute over pay. The trade union is trying to negotiate bonuses for special working hours and rules on overtime compensation. China has clarified its stance on former Soviet Union members, saying it has always respected their status as sovereign states since the dissolution of the USSR. The comment comes after China's ambassador to France caused an uproar by suggesting during a TV interview that those countries don't have actual status in international law.
湾问题上的立场没有变化。
China's position on relevant issues has not changed. Regarding territory and sovereignty issues, China's stance is constant and clear, which is respecting the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries and upholding the purposes and principles of the UN Charter.
You're watching CGTN. Still to come. Tensions rise in Eastern Europe over surplus grain from Ukraine. There are calls for the EU to step in.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Hi there, welcome back. A reminder of our headlines. More foreign nationals are evacuated from Khartoum as the European Union calls for a negotiated end to the fighting in Sudan. The Russian foreign minister has condemned a decision by the US to deny entry visas to the Russian journalists covering his trip to the United Nations headquarters. Sergei Lavrov is chairing a Security Council meeting in New York as Russia currently holds the presidency of the 15-member body. Lavrov also warned that the prospects of the continuation of the Black Sea grain export deal were, quote, not great. And our correspondent Jody Jacobs joins us for more from New York now. What's this meeting about, Jody, and what else has Lavrov been saying ahead of this?
Well, of course, that Security Council meeting has just gotten underway here in New York City at the UN headquarters. The Russian foreign minister, of course, as you said, chairing that meeting. It's a signature event that the Russians are holding in the Security Council today. It is the defense, the multilateralism through the defense of principles of the UN Charter. That's the theme of the meeting today. But of course, Lavrov's address and chairing of this meeting comes also on the back of another meeting that he's holding with the UN Secretary General later today, and that's with regards to that Black Sea Grain Initiative deal that's literally now coming to expire on May the 18th. Russia really saying that their demands are not being met in this deal, and they need to discuss this. Of course, fertilizer and exports out of the Ukraine are moving through the Black Sea, but Russia believes that their demands in this deal are not being met. So that's something that's going to be discussed later on today between a one-on-one meeting between the UN Secretary General and the Russian foreign minister. But then, of course, just on the eve of this gathering here at the UN today, the Russian journalists not being denied access into the US. Russia saying that they will not forget and they will not forgive this. Of course, the Russian journalists wanted to travel to the US, to New York, to come and attend this week's proceedings here at the Security Council, but were denied access by the US. So we are hoping that we're going to hear some sort of response by the Russian foreign minister later during the day with regards to, one, the visa denial of Russian journalists, and as well as that Black Sea Grain Initiative deal that is set to probably not continue if Russia's demands are not met.
Jody Jacobs reporting from the UN in New York. Thank you very much. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell says he's confident the bloc will sign off on a plan to buy ammunition for Ukraine within days. But he also acknowledged that there was still disagreement. EU foreign ministers are meeting in Luxembourg after Kiev expressed frustration that a deal signed last month for countries to buy artillery shells for Ukraine has not yet been implemented. Artillery rounds have become critical to the conflict as forces in eastern Ukraine wage an intense war of attrition. Officials say Kiev is burning through more rounds than its allies can currently supply. Tensions are rising in Eastern Europe as more countries move to ban Ukrainian grain imports. Since the EU lifted import tariffs last summer, more than 23 million tonnes of grain have flooded into the bloc. 4 countries have temporarily suspended imports after local farmers complained that the influx of corn and wheat has disrupted the market. Pablo Gutierrez reports.
Lazar Kiss and his family have run this farm outside of Budapest for more than 30 years. But since last summer, turning a profit on their products has been much harder.
It was a very dry year. We lost 30 to 40% of our crops. Things then became worse when large amounts of Ukrainian corn and wheat came into the market. Prices dropped 50%.
Many farmers throughout Eastern Europe shared the same frustration. Since the European Union suspended all import tariffs for Ukraine, the influx of grains and other agricultural products has created what they argue is unfair competition and cut their earnings. Last year, with seaports blocked, Ukrainian grain started moving in trucks and trains to Eastern European countries, but instead of reaching other markets in the EU, most of the products became stranded in Ukraine bordering countries like Poland and Hungary. Experts say the shifting of routes will have long-term consequences.
Farmers in the next couple of years, for them, this is a huge challenge, how to make necessary adjustment to this new reality, because Ukrainian grain will flow to Europe from now, from last year and forever.
Under pressure from local farmers, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria temporarily suspended the import of Ukrainian agricultural products. Poland's government, one of the most outspoken supporters of Ukraine at an EU level since the conflict with Russia started, struck a deal with Kyiv this week to allow sealed convoys of Ukrainian grain to transit through its territory under guard. Meanwhile, Hungary has called on the EU to intervene and help move Ukrainian imports out of their country.
Hungary should have banned the imports much earlier. Currently, there are 25 Ukrainian products banned until June 30th. But if the situation remains, we're calling for the ban to be extended.
The European Commission presented a $109 million aid package to the countries affected, but the funds will only be available if they suspend the unilateral bans. Under the measure, the EU will also stop the import of Ukrainian grains until June 5th, and it is committed to investigating whether additional measures are required for other Ukrainian agricultural products. It's welcome news for an agriculture sector battling to survive. Farmers say the cost of running a farm has soared this past year. They have to pay more for fuel, fertilizer, and also labor. Meanwhile, their profits have dwindled. But for farmers like Kiz, the damage has already been done. Pablo Gutierrez, CGTN, Dansen Miklos, Hungary.
Well, from the land to the skies, it's Space Day in China, held on the anniversary of the country's first satellite launch back in 1970. More than half a century after that historic launch, the global space industry is thriving. It's expected to generate $1 trillion in annual revenue by around 2040. So who spends big on space? Well, the United States remains the biggest public and private spender, but China is in second place after its rapid rise to becoming a global leader in space exploration. The Chinese government spent $12 billion on space programs last year. Technological advances are making it easier for more countries to enter the space market. 20 across 4 continents now have government space budgets of more than $100 million, while at least 70 nations have active space programs. Private and commercial spending on space programs has more than tripled since the early 2000s. In 2020, it totaled $350 billion, and that's expected to keep growing. Major players include Elon Musk's SpaceX and Blue Origin, which is owned by Jeff Bezos. Small satellites, which are 90% cheaper and faster to produce than large satellites, are becoming more and more common. They now make up 94% of all space launches. And 3D printing is also playing a big part in decreasing the cost of launches. Some rocket engines now only take 24 hours to produce. While the event's host city, Hefei, is fast becoming China's fastest growing centre for developing new space technology. It's aiming to have a space manufacturing industry worth $1.5 billion in the next 2 years. Our correspondent Sun Ye reports.
Hefei, the host city for this year's Space Day of China, moved to accelerate what it calls the promising racetrack of aerospace and aviation information industry in 2021.
In less than 2 years, the city has signed on more than 30 projects with an investment commitment of over 20 billion yuan. Companies have come to view Hefei as a hub for the space industry. Among them is GeoVis, a tech company that develops products for use in aerospace data systems and services. GeoVis has opened 4 branches in Hefei over the past 24 months, with revenue totaling 252 million yuan.
The development of the aerospace information industry in the whole of Anhui province has been very fast over the past 2 years. and what we're doing in the field of commercial aerospace dovetails with policies and has received great support in Hefei. Speaking of commercial aerospace development, we can see, for example, that China has a large commercial satellite launch plan, and that, of course, requires commercial companies to provide services.
Hefei's 5-year plan envisions the creation of a satellite manufacturing industry worth 10 billion yuan by 2025 as part of a 100 billion yuan aerospace and aviation information industry. The city is also home to many research labs and cutting-edge science and technology centers. It's committed to using that scientific prowess to power up the space information industry. Sun Ye, CGTN, Hefei in Anhui Province.
And finally, back on Earth, as China's economic and global influence grow, more and more people around the world are choosing to learn Mandarin. This weekend saw the final of a China Business Comprehension Contest for UK college students. And as CGTN's Michael Voss reports, each had to impress the judges with both their fluency in Mandarin and their business ideas.
To get to the Mandarin-speaking finals of the Chinese business competition demands a love of language as well as business skills. Mandarin is the first foreign language that Morgan Livingston has mastered.
So I'd done French at school, but I didn't really like it because it was full of grammar tables. Chinese doesn't have that. Chinese was actually a lot easier to get into than I thought, because when I started, everyone was feeding me horror stories, like it's the hardest language in the world ever to learn. But actually, it turned out to be really fun.
Others found the lack of grammar more challenging.
So my background is 7-8 years in German and also in Latin, so growing up with very strict grammar and all that kind of stuff. So within Chinese, the not absence of grammar, but the very different grammar is a nightmare, really. But
for Greek national Josephina Giopoulou, there were other challenges.
Like, obviously Greek also has a different alphabet, so learning like a third way of writing was quite interesting, but also very challenging. Like strokes and tones are things that we don't encounter in Greek or English.
The event is organised by the Confucius Institute. It's a spin-off of their long-standing China Bridge competition, which focuses more on culture rather than business language.
Many of the students are taking combined courses involving Chinese culture and history as well as business studies. Some claim that Mandarin is more expressive than English, so better suited to writing poetry and literature than business deals. But Barbara Lekis disagrees.
So I actually find quite fascinating the way you can express business idea in Chinese. It's very, you can use a lot of poetic language, so it can kind of like get sharp but with beauty, so in a way that you can't express that in English for sure.
The overall winner was Samuel Hardy. His presentation was about a startup he's launching this summer, importing classical Chinese instruments to Europe, linked to a directory of instrumental teachers and musicians.
At the beginning, one of the judges said that one of the key factors they were going to be looking for was passion, and I'm very passionate about Chinese music and do want to start this company. I'm going to be starting it over the summer, so I think possibly that was it. But I'm honestly not sure. It was a big surprise for me. Big surprise.
Michael Voss, CGTN, London.
Oh, good luck to Samuel. That's The World Today. Thank you for watching. We're back with more news at the top of the hour. Up next, it's World Insight with Tian Wei. Bye for now.
This is CGTN,
China Global Television Network.